I'd like to talk a little bit about essay writing today, um, just to make sure that my expectations are clear. Hopefully, this will be review for many of you, but hopefully, it will still have some useful information for you. Essay needs a good thesis statement. A literary essay is always an argument of some kind. It advances a particular position, and the thesis statement is the expression of that. So here are a few tips on how to write a good thesis statement. Number one, make sure it's clear and specific. You want to avoid vague language. Don't just say something is good or interesting. Explain why it's interesting, what matters about it, what in particular is the issue you want to address. Number two, it should be relevant. Always ask who cares, trying to get deeper into your topic. So, for example, Wordsworth uses a lower form of poetic diction in his poetry. Well, who cares? Why does that matter? If you start asking that question, then you get into bigger issues around poetics and his reaction against the principles of 18th century poetry, and then that can lead you to a stronger thesis statement about what exactly Wordsworth is doing in his poetry. Number three, it has to be debatable. If you can't imagine someone arguing against you, then that can't be your thesis statement. It has to be something that you can at least imagine another position to, so that you can then try to persuade your reader why your interpretation is correct. So if you can't argue against it, you can't argue for it. Number four, it should be original to some degree. Again, as with the posts, I'm not expecting you to write something that nobody's ever thought of before, but do try to put your own take on the material we're talking about. Don't just repeat the material from lecture or from other critics. Number five, it should be analytic, not evaluative. So basically, I don't really care how much you like or don't like the poetry you're reading. What I care about is how you can explain it, how you can analyze it, how you can make some kind of sense of it. Again, if it's sometimes an easy fallback in writing an essay is saying how brilliant the author is, but that really doesn't matter. What you need to do is show how the author is working and how the text is working. And finally, a good thesis statement is firm but flexible. You want to be assertive but not overconfident. Again, you want to acknowledge that there are other positions, that your answer isn't the only answer, but at the same time, you do want to make clear that you are convinced by your position and you want your reader to be persuaded as well. Tips on writing a good introduction. Number one, don't simply repeat the terms of the question. If you're asked, to write an essay that analyzes lyrical ballads, don't say, I am going to write an essay that analyzes lyrical ballads. You want to start by putting things in your own words, and setting your own terms for the argument you want to make. Don't promise, perform. Don't say, in this essay, I am going to show. Rather, just get started and start showing it. The more you kind of pad your introduction with that prefatory material, the more quickly your reader gets bored and loses interest with what you have to say. You want to avoid meaningless generalizations. That anytime you use phrases like society thinks or broad phrases like that, again, you're really not saying anything. It's who is society? What particular group of amongst society are you talking about? There is no one monolithic idea of society. And similarly and relatedly, avoid universalizing claims. Nothing you say about literature or society is going to be true in every case. Finally, many writing instructors advise you to write your introduction after you've written your body paragraphs. Once you write your body paragraphs, you know what you're arguing in your essay, so it becomes maybe a bit easier to write your introduction. Personally, I can't do it that way, but I know a lot of people do. So take that tip and see if it works for you. In terms of essay structure, I feel like in high school they teach you the sandwich model. You've got an introduction and a conclusion that are the pieces of bread, and then the body paragraphs are your filling. But there's this sense in which that kind of creates a feeling of you have to have exactly 3 body paragraphs in every essay, and that's not really true. You want to find a structure that works for your essay, that has some kind of unity to it. What makes sense for the argument you want to make? Again, you want to avoid sweeping and extreme arguments. You want to provide a detailed answer to the question. So again, work at the level of specifics rather than broad generalizations. You can refute arguments that oppose your own, but you want to do so with respect. Acknowledge that the other side might have a valid argument, but show why your argument is better. And again, avoid evaluation, whether it's of the author or of characters. It doesn't matter whether you think they're good or bad or right or wrong. What matters is how the text operates. The conclusion can often be the hardest part of an essay because you don't want to simply rehash what you've already said, but you also can't introduce new evidence or ideas this late in your essay. So keep conclusions brief is my number one advice. And pay attention. If you find yourself saying something different in your conclusion than you said in your introduction, think about why that is. Is this a point that you have proved in your essay? Is this maybe something that should have been in your thesis statement all along? And if so, go back and change your introduction. I've seen a lot of essays that kind of work themselves up to the point where in their conclusion they figure out what they really wanted to say. But because nothing in the beginning of the essay had anticipated that, the essay itself feels very disjointed. So make sure that the thing you want to prove is the same at the beginning and the end of the essay. In terms of writing style, make sure you always use present tense when you're talking about works of literature. Literature is not history. It's not over and done with. It happens continually every time you or someone else opens the book. So, this is important because your job is not to tell me what happened. Your job is to explain why it continues to be relevant, how the language of the text has created it, and so on. So it's not something that is an artifact of the past. It's still relevant in the present. In terms of your reader, you can assume that you're writing for a reader who is familiar with the text you're discussing, but not necessarily an expert. So you should not summarize the poem in great detail, but neither should you assume your reader knows the poem by heart. So you do want to provide some kind of explanatory context, but it does not need to be a highly detailed point-by-point explanation. Never refer to your reader as you. You're writing for a general reader, anybody who could read your essay, not a specific person that you could identify as you. In terms of quotations, I want to emphasize that quotations are essential for the writing of an effective literary essay. The quotations are the direct evidence that you need to support your argument. Just like you would not do a chemistry experiment without chemicals, you cannot write a literary essay without quotations. They are very important. So make sure that whatever you're writing about, identify the important quotations that you want to use and make sure you work them into your essay. Quote in as much or as little detail as necessary. You don't want to quote just for the sake of quoting, but you do want to make sure that you're including the key passages that you want to talk about. Moreover, every time you do use a quotation, you should also be explaining it. And the explanation should be roughly in proportion to the amount of text you quote. Is it a long quotation? Then it deserves a long explanation. Is it a short quotation? Then you maybe can explain it very briefly. But you have to justify why that quotation is there and what you're using it for. And always be sure to make the connection between the quotations you choose and the argument you're making. You can't assume your reader will simply make those connections for you. You can't just throw in 4 lines of poetry and say, there, I've proved my point. You haven't proved anything until you've explained how those lines of poetry prove the point that you want to make. On a more technical level, in quoting verse, there are 2 different ways of handling it, depending on whether they're short quotations or long quotations. So here's an example of a short quotation. Blake's speaker ends the poem by asking, quote, "What immortal hand or eye?" Notice the slash after that line, "Dare frame thy fearful symmetry." The slash indicates a new line starts here. And then the line number following the quotation. You cite poems by line number, not page number, as is usual in MLA style. Another reason why it's very useful to have the textbook, because the textbook gives you the lineation for the poems. But then the reason for this is that if you give the line number, then whatever book somebody is reading, they can always find that specific line in that particular poem, even if they're using a different book. For longer quotations, you notice the indent here before each line, so it's indented from the margins, and there are no quotation marks. So the indent is what tells your reader this is a quotation. Notice that there are no slashes as there were in the short quotations. With the long quotations, you know the line ends because this is where it ends, that you're retaining the lineation from the poem itself, whereas in the short quotations you're incorporating it into the lineation of your own text. Moreover, you need to make sure you integrate your quotations into your essay grammatically and logically. This means, number 1, quotations should not be in a sentence by themselves. You don't want to just write your text, throw in a quotation, write more of your text. You need to use your text to anticipate the quotation, as I did in the previous 2 slides. In some cases, this means you might need to alter quotations using square brackets or ellipses. For example, the basic rule here is you always quote exactly what is written, except when you need to change it for either grammatical integration or to condense information. And the square brackets indicate where the alterations take place. So the 2 examples here, In London, Blake's speaker wanders through each chartered street. In the poem itself, it's the line is "I wandered through each chartered street," but because your text demands the use of the third person, you have to change the line of the poem and indicate that you have changed it with the square bracket around the S. With the ellipsis, you use this to indicate omitted material. So the nurse claims that when the voices of the children are heard on the green, my heart is at rest within my breast. In this case, the second line of the poem is not relevant to what the author of the essay wants to show, and therefore is being omitted. Notice that you do not need to use an ellipsis to start or end a quotation unless there is a missing sense that you're showing. Yes, this quotation goes on and closes this thought, but I'm not including the entire quotation. When the quotation is self-contained, as it is in this case, you do not need the ellipsis before or after. It's in fact very rare that you would use an ellipsis before or after at the end of beginning or end of a quotation. Just a couple of formal essay conventions. I'm not one to say that it's always wrong to use I in a formal essay, but a lot of uses of I are not very helpful. So try to avoid using I, especially when it weakens your argument. My point here is if you are using it to say I think or in my opinion, you're weakening your argument. You want to be presenting an argument that is valid, not just subjectively because you think it's valid, objectively because you have evidence to back it up. So in some cases you can use I. For example, if you're saying my argument differs from so-and-so's argument because I think this is more important, there you're using I to differentiate an argument, your argument from somebody else's, and in that case it's more acceptable. And is not just sort of weakening your argument by making it seem like it's just an opinion. As I've said before, you want to avoid using you. You should not use contractions like it's, he'll, she's. You want to spell those words out in full. Similarly, you would write out small numbers in full, like 16th century. Larger numbers, such as a date, like 1802, you would still use numerals. You wouldn't spell that out in letters. Just a couple of points about writing about poetry in particular. Pay attention to formal qualities. I've been trying to highlight them in the early videos in this course, and especially notice ones that are striking or unusual. You're not going to point out that a sonnet has 14 lines or it's written in iambic pentameter because you know that all sonnets have those features. But you might point out how the iambic pentameter is used to create a particular effect in a particular case. So be specific about the formal qualities you're talking about. And make sure you give some explanation for why the literary devices you're talking about are meaningful. Don't just list interesting points. You don't just say, Wordsworth personifies the daffodils. Well, why does he do that? What's meaningful about the way that he does it? That's the question that you need to answer rather than just identifying a particular device. Pay careful attention to voice, tone, and persona. We've talked a lot already about how the speaker of a poem might be different from the poet, the actually existing author. So a lot might depend on those kinds of issues. So pay attention to how the poem is presented. What's the voice like? What's the tone like? What is the character of the speaker? If the character is either if the character is the same or if the character is different from the poet or seems the same. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, remember that every element in every literary work is there for a reason. That any element that you identify, don't think, well, maybe it's just an accident, or maybe I'm reading into this. No, if an element is there, it has a function. So your job as an essay writer is to analyze the function of that element. We can never know an author's intention. All we have is the poem that the author has written. So we can't say, well, Wordsworth meant to do this. All we know is what Wordsworth actually did in this poem. But that is the key, that we have to identify what are the significant elements in the poem and how are they important. That is ultimately your task in writing an effective essay.